Dad. Dad, you won't believe what just happened. This flight attendant just slapped me. Flight attendant loses patience and hits a teen boy in first class. Seconds later, his dad's voice comes over the radio. The sharp crack of skin against skin silences the first-class cabin instantly. Laura Bennett's hand hangs suspended in the air, her own shocked expression mirroring that of the teenage boy whose cheek now bears the crimson imprint of her fingers. 27. Passengers collectively hold their breath. The boy's eyes, wide with disbelief, fill with tears he refuses to let fall. "I didn't," he starts, but Laura cuts him off with a trembling finger pointed directly at his face. "I don't care who you think you are," she hisses, voice low, but carrying in the deathly quiet cabin. "You don't belong up here." That's when the overhead speakers crackle to life, and a deep authoritative voice fills the cabin. "This is Captain Thompson speaking. Flight attendant Laura Bennett, please report to the cockpit immediately." The voice pauses, then adds with deliberate emphasis, "That's my son you just struck." Laura's face drains of color. Her perfectly applied makeup now accentuates the horror etching itself across her features as 27 pairs of eyes swivel from the stunned teenager to her frozen form. In her 19 years as a flight attendant, she had never once raised a hand to a passenger until today, until this boy. And now, 30,000 feet above the Northeast, she realizes she's made the worst mistake of her career, possibly her life. But to understand how we arrived at this breaking point, how a respected flight attendant came to strike the pilot's son in full view of a first-class cabin, we need to go back to where it all began, just 47 minutes earlier, when Flight 3921 from New York to Miami was preparing for departure. If you're watching this video right now, take a moment to click that subscribe button to join our community of storytellers and never miss another riveting true story like this one. The evening air at JFK International Airport carried that distinctive blend of jet fuel and anticipation that Laura Bennett had grown accustomed to over her nearly 2 decades with Atlantic Airways. At 43, Laura moved through Terminal 4 with practiced efficiency, her Navy uniform crisp despite the late hour. Her dark hair secured in a regulation bun that highlighted cheekbones grown sharper with age and stress. Today marked day 4 of a 6-day rotation, and the familiar weight of exhaustion pressed against her temples. Laura's divorce had been finalized just 3 months ago, and the financial strain of suddenly maintaining her Brooklyn apartment on a single income had forced her to pick up extra shifts. The vibration of her phone, her ex-husband no doubt calling about the alimony payment she was late on, went deliberately ignored as she swiped her ID at the security checkpoint. "Evening, Bennett," nodded Sam, the TSA agent, who'd been working this checkpoint as long as Laura had been flying this route. "Another night in the friendly skies? Nothing friendly about an 8:45 p.m. departure," Laura replied, with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd been up since 5:30 p.m., after a day of fitful sleep, punctuated by anxiety dreams about bills she couldn't pay and a future she couldn't secure. Laura's life hadn't always been defined by financial precarity and exhaustion. 15 years ago, when she married David, then a promising young attorney, at a prestigious New York firm, the future had seemed limitless. Their wedding at the Plaza Hotel had been featured in New York Magazine's Celebrations section, their honeymoon in Capri capturing the perfect blend of romance and sophistication they'd cultivated in their shared image. The mortgage on their Park Slope brownstone had seemed manageable with their combined incomes, the yacht club membership a reasonable splurge for networking purposes. The first cracks appeared 7 years in when David missed their anniversary dinner to entertain clients. Laura had sat alone at Le Bernardin nursing a glass of champagne while fielding pitying glances from the waitstaff. By year 10, David was consistently working 80-hour weeks, climbing the partnership ladder with single-minded determination. Laura maintained their social calendar, served on charity boards, and filled their home with tasteful furniture that David barely noticed. They became masters of parallel living, sharing space, but rarely connecting. When David announced he was leaving 4 days after their 14th anniversary, Laura wasn't surprised by the fact, but by the timing. He'd waited until she returned from a 3-day trip to Paris, sitting her down in their rarely used formal living room, with the precision of someone executing a long-planned strategy. "It's not working anymore," he'd said, his attorney's voice dispassionate. "We both know that." What Laura hadn't anticipated was how thoroughly he'd prepared the separate bank account he'd established months earlier, the apartment he'd already leased. The meticulous documentation of their finances that somehow minimized his assets while highlighting hers. The divorce proceedings moved with the brisk efficiency of a business transaction, leaving Laura stunned by the clinical dismantling of her life. She'd kept the brownstone initially clinging to the last vestige of the life she'd built. But 6 months of mortgage payments without David's income had drained her savings. The yacht club membership lapsed. Friends, mostly David's colleagues and their wives, drifted away with the casual cruelty of those who choose sides without acknowledging they're doing so. Laura sold the brownstone at a loss and moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in Bed-Stuy, where the constant hum of the subway punctuated her insomnia. Now, walking through JFK at 8:15 p.m., Laura calculated the hours until her next paycheck and the bills that would consume it before it hit her account. The property management company had called twice yesterday about the rent check that was now 8 days late. Her car insurance was due next week. And David, despite the alimony agreement, had become increasingly forgetful about payments, his new girlfriend's lifestyle apparently taking precedence over his legal obligations. In the crew lounge, Laura poured herself a 3rd cup of coffee, the styrofoam cup crackling slightly in her grip. Maria Torres, the senior flight attendant for today's flight, approached with the easy confidence of someone who'd found her rhythm in life. "You look like you could use something stronger than that." Maria observed her dark eyes warm with concern beneath precisely shaped eyebrows. At 52, Maria had the serene demeanor of someone who'd seen it all and chosen to find humor rather than hardship in the journey. "Don't tempt me," Laura muttered, taking a scalding sip. David called again last night. Apparently his new 28-year-old girlfriend needs a car, and somehow that's become my problem. Maria's eyebrows rose. The ex-husband saga continues. How many years younger is this one? 15 years younger than me? 12 years younger than the last girlfriend? Laura's laugh held no humor. At this rate, he'll be dating a high schooler by Christmas. Men, Maria said the single word carrying 19 years of shared workplace confidences. She glanced at her watch. Boarding starts in 40. Captain today is William Thompson. You've flown with him before, right? Laura nodded. A few times, keeps to himself, but he's good professional. None of that "where's my coffee, sweetheart" nonsense. Some of the older captains still pull. He's got his son flying with him today, Maria mentioned, scanning the flight manifest on her tablet. 16-year-old in first class. Apparently the kid's visiting colleges in Florida this week. Great, Laura sighed, crumpling her empty cup. Another privileged teenager playing on their phone during the safety demonstration. Hey, Maria squeezed her shoulder. One flight at a time, right Miami tonight, then a 24-hour layover. We'll hit that wine bar in South Beach, my treat. For the first time that evening, Laura's smile reached her eyes. You're the only reason I haven't quit this job, Maria. But Maria's attention had shifted to the lounge entrance where Captain William Thompson was entering alongside his co-pilot, Daniel Lee. At 51, Captain Thompson commanded respect without demanding it. 6'2" with broad shoulders and the poised carriage of a former military pilot, he moved with purpose, his dark skin contrasting with the crisp white of his pilot's shirt, 4 gold stripes gleaming on each shoulder. "Ladies," he greeted them with a professional nod. "Bennett Torres, ready for an on-time departure." "Always, Captain," Maria responded with the easy rapport of veterans. Laura merely nodded her attention, caught by the young man who had entered behind the pilots. Tall and lanky with his father's build not yet filled out, Ethan Thompson stood uncertainly in the crew lounge doorway. He wore pressed khakis and a blue button-down shirt that spoke of his father's insistence on appropriate attire for first class. But his slightly hunched shoulders and the wary look in his eyes revealed his discomfort in the space. "My son Ethan," Captain Thompson introduced with unmistakable pride. "He's shadowing me today before we tour the University of Miami tomorrow. The boy's got a mind for engineering." Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention. "Dad, I haven't even applied yet," he murmured, his voice deeper than Laura expected, but with a slight crack of adolescence still present. "And when you do, they'll be lucky to have you," his father replied, with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his son's potential. He turned back to the flight attendants. "First Officer Lee and I need to complete our pre-flight. Ethan will board with the first-class passengers." As the pilots departed, Laura found herself studying Ethan more closely. There was none of the entitled arrogance she'd come to expect from teenagers traveling in first class. Instead, he stood with a watchfulness that seemed out of place for his age, as though he were constantly calculating his surroundings. "First time flying first class?" Maria asked him warmly. "No, ma'am," Ethan answered with reflexive politeness. "Just the first time without my mom along. She usually handles all the interaction stuff." Something in his phrasing caught Laura's attention, but before she could process it, her phone vibrated again. This time it was her landlord, the third call this week about the rent check that would bounce if David didn't transfer the alimony he owed her. She silenced it with trembling fingers. "Everything okay?" Maria asked quietly, as Ethan busied himself with his backpack. "Fine," Laura replied too quickly. "Just fine." But it wasn't fine. And as she walked toward Gate C-22, where Flight 3921 waited, Laura felt the weight of her accumulated stress pressing down like the altitude changes that sometimes made her ears pop painfully. One more flight, she told herself. Just get through one more flight. She couldn't have known then how this particular flight would change everything. William Thompson had not planned on becoming a pilot. Growing up in Harlem, New York in the 1980s, his aspirations had been more pragmatic, perhaps engineering like his father, who worked at a factory in Long Island City, or teaching like his mother, who taught third grade at PS 125. Aviation seemed as distant as the planes that crossed the sky above his neighborhood, visible but untouchable. Then came the career day in 8th grade, when a pilot from Delta Airlines, one of the few black commercial pilots at the time, visited PS 125. Captain Charles Harris stood before William's class in his uniform, those gleaming stripes on his shoulders representing authority, respect, possibilities. "The sky doesn't care what color your skin is," Captain Harris had told them. "It only cares if you have the skill and determination to navigate it." That night, 14-year-old William had announced to his parents that he was going to become a pilot. His father had nodded thoughtfully, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply acknowledging. His mother had smiled and said, "Then you'll need straight A's in math and science," her practical support setting the tone for the years of education ahead. The path had not been easy. William worked after school and summers at his uncle's bodega to save for flying lessons, taking his first solo flight on his 17th birthday. He attended Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University on a combination of scholarships and loans, graduating with honors and a commercial pilot's license. Then came the military route the Air Force offering the fastest track to the flight hours he would need for a commercial career. 8 years as an Air Force pilot, including deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, had honed not just William's flying skills, but his ability to maintain composure under pressure. He learned to expect scrutiny to perform flawlessly because anything less would be attributed not just to him, but to every black pilot who would follow. He perfected the balance of authority and approachability that would serve him well in commercial aviation, firm enough to command respect, personable enough to put passengers and crew at ease. When he transitioned to Atlantic Airways at 33, William was one of only 12 black pilots at the airline. He noted the surprise that sometimes flickered across passengers' faces when they glimpsed him through the cockpit door, the way some colleagues would test him with subtle questions about procedures he knew by heart. He documented every flight, meticulously maintained his uniform with military precision, arrived early to every briefing. Excellence was not a goal, but a requirement. Meeting Karen Brooks, the daughter of Captain Charles Harris, whose career day visit had changed his life, seemed like fate. She was a pediatrician, with her father's warm smile and direct gaze, unimpressed by the uniform, but appreciative of the man who wore it. They married when William was 35, Karen 33, both established in careers that fulfilled them. Ethan arrived a year later, a colicky baby, who settled only when William held him while humming jazz standards. From infancy, Ethan showed a methodical curiosity about how things worked, dismantling his toys to examine their mechanisms. By kindergarten, he was building elaborate structures with Legos, following the instructions with a precision that amused his parents. In first grade, he corrected his teacher's explanation of how airplanes fly, reciting Bernoulli's principle with the seriousness of a professor. It was around this time that William and Karen began to notice the pattern, the birthday party invitations that never came, the playdates that were canceled last minute. The way parents at school events would greet Karen warmly, but maintain a polite distance from William, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Ethan was 8 when he first asked, "Dad, how come Tyler's mom didn't want him to come to our house?" William had been preparing for this conversation since Ethan was born, but the reality of it still landed like a blow. He and Karen had explained as simply as they could about prejudice, about how some people made judgments based on appearance rather than character. They emphasized that this was about the other person's limitations, not Ethan's worth. "You will always have to be better," William had told his son, the same words his own father had spoken to him. "Not because you should have to be, but because that's the reality we live in. But never ever doubt that you belong wherever your talents and hard work take you." As Ethan grew, these conversations evolved, becoming more nuanced, but no less necessary. When Ethan was 12, and a mall security guard followed him through a store while ignoring his white friends, William added another layer to the ongoing dialogue. "Your response in these moments says more about you than their actions say about them," he explained. "Find the balance between standing up for yourself and choosing your battles." Now at 16, Ethan navigated the world with a careful awareness that broke William's heart even as it filled him with pride. His son had developed a watchfulness, an ability to read rooms and situations that most adults never mastered. He excelled academically, played jazz saxophone with soul beyond his years, and maintained a small circle of loyal friends who saw him clearly. When Ethan expressed interest in aerospace engineering, William had arranged this college visit to the University of Miami, combining it with his flight schedule to give his son a glimpse of his professional world. Karen had been hesitant. "Are you sure about him flying alone in first class?" she'd asked the night before, as William packed his uniform. "You know how people can be." "He needs to experience it," William had replied. Better with me on the flight than truly alone. And he can't live his life avoiding situations where he might be the only black person in the room. Karen had nodded understanding, but concerned. Just make sure he knows he can call you if anything happens. He knows, William assured her, though something in him hoped this flight would be unremarkable, that his son could simply enjoy the privilege of first class without the burden of others' perceptions. As William completed his pre-flight checks in the cockpit of Flight 3921, he glanced at the family photo secured beside his instruments. Karen's laughing face, Ethan's serious expression softened by the hint of a smile. He thought of his son sitting in first class reading his aerospace engineering book, and felt the familiar mixture of hope and worry that had defined his experience of fatherhood. First Officer Daniel Lee interrupted his thoughts. Weather report just came in. Looks clear all the way to Miami. Good, William nodded, returning his focus to the task at hand. Let's get these people to Florida on time. 18 years as a flight attendant, Maria Torres had developed a sixth sense about flights, which would be smooth, which would be challenging, which might become the stories she'd tell at crew gatherings for years to come. As she organized the galley for Flight 3921, something about the energy felt off, a subtle disharmony she couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was Laura's obvious distress, the shadows under her eyes not quite concealed by makeup, the slight tremor in her hands as she counted juice cups. Maria had known Laura for 14 years, had watched her progression from eager new hire to seasoned professional. They'd supported each other through the industry's upheavals, 9/11's devastating impact on aviation, the 2008 financial crisis that led to furloughs and benefit cuts, the mergers that reshuffled crews and routes. They'd shared hotel rooms on layovers, celebrated promotions, attended each other's life milestones. Maria had been there when Laura met David at a crew party, had helped plan their wedding, had listened as Laura's marriage slowly unraveled in confidences shared over airport coffees and hotel minibars. She'd witnessed Laura's gradual transformation from confident professional to someone perpetually bracing for the next blow. "You need to see someone," Maria had urged last month, after finding Laura crying in the lavatory during a flight to Atlanta. "A therapist, a financial advisor, someone." "With what money?" Laura had responded, wiping her eyes with mechanical efficiency. "Do you know what my copay is, since they switched our insurance $50 a session? That's groceries for a week, Maria." Maria understood financial strain better than most. As a single mother who had raised 2 daughters on a flight attendant's salary, she'd mastered the art of stretching paychecks and juggling priorities. Her own divorce, 15 years earlier, had left her with twin 4-year-olds and a mortgage she could barely afford. There had been nights when she'd fed the girls mac and cheese, while she herself ate nothing, bill-paying sessions that ended in tears, Christmas mornings made possible only by her parents' generosity. But Maria had also had advantages. Laura lacked parents willing and able to help with childcare, an ex-husband who paid child support reliably, if not enthusiastically, a rental property inherited from her grandmother that provided modest additional income. She had weathered her financial storm and emerged, if not wealthy, then stable and debt-free, her daughters now in college on scholarships and part-time jobs. She recognized in Laura's current struggle the particular panic of financial insecurity, the constant mental calculations, the dread of unexpected expenses, the exhaustion of maintaining appearances while everything crumbled internally. Maria had been trying to support her friend without overstepping, offering meals during layovers, suggesting cheaper housing options, even considering offering a loan before deciding that might damage their friendship if repayment became an issue. Now, watching Laura mechanically prepare for the flight service, Maria resolved to be more direct during their Miami layover. She would insist on helping Laura create a budget, perhaps contact a credit counselor, maybe even research legal options if David was consistently late with alimony. Laura needed more than wine and sympathy. She needed a concrete path forward. Maria's concern for her friend temporarily distracted her from her usual pre-flight routine of assessing the manifest. Normally, she would scan for potential issues: frequent flyers with known preferences, passengers with mobility issues, anyone with a history of in-flight incidents. By the time she turned her attention to these details, boarding had already begun. She quickly noted the usual first-class demographic for an evening business flight: executives in custom suits, a smattering of wealthy retirees, the occasional upgraded frequent flyer. Two names triggered her internal alert system: Patricia Langston, a passenger who had filed complaints on 3 previous flights, and Ethan Thompson, the captain's teenage son. Under different circumstances, Maria would have assigned herself to Patricia Langston's section, using her decades of experience to manage the demanding passenger. Today, she hesitated, uncertain whether Laura needed the buffer, or whether the distraction of service might actually help her focus on something beyond her personal troubles. Before she could decide, Laura had already positioned herself to serve the first-class section containing both Langston and young Thompson. Maria made a mental note to monitor the situation closely. Something about this flight still felt precarious, balanced on the edge of incident. After 19 years in the air, Maria had learned to trust these instincts. She just hoped whatever happened would be manageable, a minor service issue, perhaps, or a bit of light turbulence. Nothing that would add to the burden Laura was already carrying. As she moved to her position for boarding, Maria offered a silent prayer to St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers whom her Catholic mother had invoked before every flight since Maria joined the airline. "Just get us all to Miami in one piece," she murmured, body and spirit intact. Gate C-22 hummed with the particular energy of a full flight. Business travelers tapped impatiently on laptops, families corralled sleepy children, and the gate agent's voice announced boarding procedures with the cadence of someone who had repeated the same phrases thousands of times. Laura surveyed the waiting passengers with the practiced eye of someone who could spot potential trouble before it boarded. Ethan Thompson had positioned himself slightly apart from the first-class line, absorbed in a book about aerospace engineering. Unlike the other teenagers scattered throughout the gate area, his phone remained in his pocket. Laura felt a twinge of something reassessment, perhaps, before her attention was drawn to a commotion at the desk. "I specifically requested 2A, not 2C. This is completely unacceptable." The woman's voice carried across the gate area, sharp with entitlement. Blonde, mid-50s, dressed in a Chanel suit that probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent. She leaned aggressively across the counter toward the harried gate agent. "I apologize, Ms. Langston," the agent responded with strained professionalism. "But as I explained, there was an equipment change, and the first-class configuration—" "I don't care about configurations," Patricia Langston interrupted. "I'm a Platinum Executive member. Do you know how many miles I fly annually with this airline? Fix it." Maria caught Laura's eye and made a subtle drinking motion with her hand. It was their private signal for difficult passengers who would likely be requesting frequent beverage service. Laura nodded, already mentally assigning Patricia Langston to Maria's section of first class. In her current state, Laura didn't trust herself to maintain the placid demeanor required. Patricia Langston had not always been this person. The imperious customer service nightmare who reduced airline staff to tense smiles, the woman whose very approach caused hotel concierges to straighten their spines in anticipation of demands. Once she had been Patricia Hayes from Albany, New York, a bright, ambitious girl with perfect grades and a yearbook full of activities determined to escape her middle-class origins. Columbia University had been her first taste of real wealth. The casual extravagance of roommates who thought nothing of weekend trips to Paris, the subtle social hierarchies based on family names and summer homes. Patricia had studied these classmates with anthropological precision, noting the brands they wore, the inflections in their speech, the way they occupied space as though it naturally belonged to them. She adapted quickly, shedding her upstate accent, curating a wardrobe from sample sales and thrift stores in wealthy neighborhoods, accepting invitations to homes where she observed and absorbed the rules of a world she intended to join. Her marriage to Edward Langston, scion of a Connecticut real estate family, had been the culmination of this careful self-creation. The wedding at the Langston estate in Greenwich had featured in Town and Country Patricia's parents looking uncomfortable but proud in the few photos where they appeared. The marriage lasted 12 years, long enough for Patricia to secure her position in Manhattan society, to produce 2 sons, who were now at boarding schools in Connecticut, to establish herself as a formidable fundraiser for the right charities. The divorce had been amicable on paper, vicious in reality. Edward had already moved on with his yoga instructor. Patricia had already consulted the best divorce attorneys in New York. They had parted with mutual disdain and a settlement that allowed Patricia to maintain her lifestyle while freeing Edward to marry his younger girlfriend without financial penalty. Now, at 55, Patricia Langston served on the boards of 3 cultural institutions, maintained homes in Manhattan's Upper East Side and the Hamptons, and traveled frequently for both business and pleasure. She had constructed a life of immaculate surfaces, designer clothes, meticulous highlights, rigorous fitness regimen that concealed the constant gnawing fear of being exposed as an imposter, of losing her hard-won place in a world she had not been born to. This anxiety expressed itself as control over her environment, her appearance, her interactions. Any deviation from her expectations, any challenge to her authority, triggered a defensive anger that had become her reflexive response to perceived threats. The gate agent who couldn't provide her preferred seat was not just an airline employee doing their job. They were a potential unraveling of the careful order Patricia maintained to keep her insecurities at bay. As boarding began, and Laura took her position at the aircraft door, she felt the familiar disconnection that had become her coping mechanism. Smile, welcome, direct. The routine allowed her to function on autopilot while her mind churned through the calculations of her dwindling bank account and mounting bills. "Good evening. Welcome aboard," she repeated, her voice pleasant, but her eyes not quite connecting with the passengers who filed past. The first-class cabin filled quickly with the usual mix of business executives, wealthy retirees, and the occasional upgraded frequent flyer. Laura noticed Ethan Thompson settling into seat 3A by the window, his lanky frame folding carefully into the space as though trying to occupy as little room as possible. Patricia Langston swept into the cabin with the air of someone who considered the aircraft her personal domain, her displeasure at being seated in 2C rather than 2A, radiating from her rigid posture. She surveyed the cabin critically, her gaze landing on Ethan and lingering there with obvious disapproval. As Laura moved through the pre-flight preparations, she became aware of Patricia Langston's increasingly loud sighs and pointed glances toward Ethan. When Laura approached to offer a pre-departure beverage, Patricia leaned in conspiratorially. "I think there's been a mistake," she said in a stage whisper that carried clearly. "That young man in 3A, I believe he may have boarded incorrectly. Perhaps you should check his boarding pass." Laura glanced at Ethan, who was staring determinedly out the window, his shoulders tense, though his expression remained carefully neutral. She knew immediately what assumption Patricia was making, and despite her own stress, she felt a flicker of indignation on the boy's behalf. "All our first-class passengers have been verified at the gate, ma'am," Laura replied evenly. "Can I get you a beverage before takeoff?" Patricia's lips thinned. "Sparkling water with lemon, and I still think you should check. These things happen, you know. People end up where they don't belong." The pointed emphasis made Laura's professional smile tighten. She moved to the galley where Maria was preparing the drink cart. 2C is going to be a problem, Laura murmured. Maria rolled her eyes. Let me guess she's concerned about the captain's son. Got it in one. Want me to take your row? You've got that look. Laura squared her shoulders. No, I can handle it. She needed to handle it, needed to prove to herself that she could still do this job with the professionalism that had once defined her. As Laura distributed pre-flight beverages, she noticed Ethan declining with a polite, "No thank you, ma'am." His good manners only highlighted the contrast with Patricia Langston, who accepted her sparkling water without acknowledgement and immediately pressed the call button again. Yes, Laura returned, fighting to keep irritation from her voice. There's no lemon, Patricia stated flatly. My apologies. Laura retrieved a lemon wedge from the galley, aware of Maria's sympathetic glance. When she returned, Patricia was half-turned in her seat, staring pointedly at Ethan, who was now reading his book with deliberate concentration. Here you are, ma'am, Laura said, placing the lemon on Patricia's napkin. Thank you. Now, I don't mean to be difficult, Patricia began in a tone that suggested the opposite. But I paid for a premium experience, and I'm concerned about the atmosphere in the cabin tonight. Laura felt her professional mask slipping. Is there a specific concern I can address? Patricia lowered her voice to a whisper that nonetheless remained perfectly audible. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I know when someone is in the wrong seat. Perhaps he has a coach ticket and thought he could just sit anywhere. Ethan's knuckles whitened around his book, though his eyes remained fixed on the page. Laura noticed he hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Ma'am, I can assure you that all passengers in this cabin are ticketed for first class, Laura stated firmly. Now, if you'll excuse me, we're preparing for departure. As Laura moved away, she heard Patricia mutter, Well, I've never seen a boy like that in first class before. And something inside her, the part that had absorbed too many injustices of her own, recently twisted painfully. The boarding door closed, and the aircraft pushed back from the gate, precisely on schedule. In the cockpit, Captain Thompson's voice came over the PA system, deep and reassuring. Good evening from the flight deck. This is Captain William Thompson welcoming you aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 3921 to Miami. Our flying time tonight will be approximately 3 hours and 10 minutes. Weather looks clear along our route, so we should have a smooth flight. We're currently number 4 for departure, so sit back, relax, and we'll have you in the air shortly. In the cockpit, William adjusted his headset and glanced at First Officer Daniel Lee, who was completing the final pre-departure checklist. At 32, Lee was a relatively new addition to Atlantic's pilot corps, having joined the airline after 8 years flying for a regional carrier. William had flown with him a dozen times and found him to be meticulous calm under pressure and refreshingly straightforward qualities essential in a profession where clear communication could make the difference between routine and catastrophe. Ground control's backed up this evening, Lee observed, gesturing toward the line of aircraft visible through the cockpit window. Might be a few extra minutes before we're cleared. William nodded, using the unexpected pause to mentally review the flight plan once more. New York to Miami was a route he'd flown hundreds of times, familiar enough to be comfortable, but never routine enough to invite complacency. Tonight's weather forecast showed clear conditions across most of their route, with some potential turbulence over the Carolinas. Nothing unusual for early summer. His thoughts drifted briefly to Ethan, seated in first class. William wondered how his son was settling in, whether he was enjoying this glimpse into his father's professional world. Ethan had been on countless flights, family vacations, visits to grandparents, even accompanying William on an occasional overnight when he was younger. But this was different. This was Ethan experiencing the intersection of his father's career and his own developing interest in aviation, seeing firsthand the environment William navigated daily. A small part of William wished he could step back into the cabin just for a moment to check on his son, not because Ethan needed monitoring. At 16, he was more self-sufficient than many adults, but because William would have enjoyed seeing him in this context, observing his reactions. It was a luxury not afforded to pilots, this ability to move between worlds during flight. Instead, he would have to trust the cabin crew to ensure Ethan's comfort. Laura Bennett and Maria Torres were both experienced flight attendants. He'd flown with them enough times to know they were professionals. Bennett had seemed distracted during the pre-flight briefing, but that wasn't unusual. Flight crews led complex lives, balancing the demands of an industry that required them to be perpetually in motion with the realities of maintaining homes, relationships, and personal well-being. Ground control's voice crackled through the headset, issuing clearance for pushback. William acknowledged the instruction, then pressed the interphone to alert the lead flight attendant that departure was imminent. With practiced coordination, he and Lee guided the aircraft away from the gate, joining the queue of planes awaiting clearance for takeoff. As they taxied toward the runway, William performed a mental reset, the deliberate shift from William Thompson, father and husband, to Captain Thompson, responsible for the safe transport of 163 passengers and 7 crew members across the country. It was a compartmentalization he had mastered over decades, the ability to be fully present in his professional role while maintaining awareness of his personal connections. When Tower Control finally issued their takeoff clearance, William advanced the throttles with precise timing, feeling the familiar surge of power as the engines responded. Beside him, Lee called out speed indicators with calm efficiency. The moment of rotation when the aircraft's nose lifted from the runway and the full weight transferred from wheels to wings never failed to give William a flicker of satisfaction. No matter how many thousands of takeoffs he executed, this transition from earth to sky retained its fundamental magic. As the aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet and the seatbelt sign chimed off, William settled into the rhythm of cruise flight, the cockpit quiet, except for occasional communications with air traffic control. He thought again of Ethan in first class, imagining his son perhaps gazing out the window at the city lights unfolding below, or perhaps deep in conversation with a seatmate, or more likely, given Ethan's introverted nature, absorbed in his aerospace engineering book. William allowed himself a small smile, unseen by Lee, who was updating their flight log. The boy had his mother's intellect and his father's steady determination, a combination that filled William with quiet pride. Whatever path Ethan ultimately chose, whether following his father into aviation or pursuing his interest in engineering, William was confident his son would approach it with the same thoughtful dedication he brought to everything. The interphone chimed, drawing William back to the present moment, probably the lead flight attendant calling to confirm meal service timing. He pressed the response button, ready to resume his role as captain, the brief paternal reflection complete for now. As Laura demonstrated the safety features with mechanical precision, she noticed Ethan watching attentively, while most of the cabin, including Patricia Langston, ignored the presentation entirely. The aircraft taxied toward the runway, joining the queue of planes awaiting departure in the glowing New York evening. When the engines roared to life and the plane accelerated down the runway, Laura braced herself in the jump seat, closing her eyes briefly. This moment of takeoff, the powerful thrust, the gravity pressing her back, the sensation of the earth falling away, had once been her favorite part of flying. Lately, it only reminded her of how untethered her life had become, floating without direction or security. The climb to cruising altitude was smooth, the seatbelt sign chiming off at 10,000 feet. As Laura and Maria began the in-flight service, the cabin settled into the rhythm of an evening flight. Business travelers opened laptops. An older couple donned sleep masks, and a few passengers thumbed through the in-flight magazine. Ethan Thompson had returned to his book, seemingly lost in technical diagrams of aircraft engines. Occasionally, he would glance toward the cockpit door with a small smile of pride that made him look younger than his 16 years. For a moment, Laura saw not the teenager she'd initially categorized, but someone's child, Captain Thompson's child, navigating a world that made assumptions about him based on appearances. The moment of empathy was interrupted by Patricia Langston's imperious call button. Laura suppressed a sigh and approached. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like a mimosa," Patricia stated. "And please make sure the champagne is properly chilled this time." "Of course I'll bring that right away." As Laura prepared the drink in the galley, Maria whispered, "She's already on my last nerve and we haven't even hit turbulence yet." "Just wait," Laura replied. "She thinks the captain's son is in the wrong cabin, made some comments that she broke off, not wanting to articulate what they both understood." Maria's expression hardened. "You're kidding me. In 2025, some people never change. Captain Thompson should hear about this." "Not our place," Laura cautioned, though she silently agreed. "Let's just get through this flight." When Laura delivered the mimosa, Patricia took a deliberate sip and grimaced theatrically. "This champagne tastes like it's been open for days, and there's too much orange juice." Laura's patience, already worn tissue thin, threatened to tear completely. "I'm sorry it's not to your liking. Would you prefer something else?" "No, this will have to do, though. I don't understand why everything has to be such a struggle." Patricia's gaze drifted deliberately toward Ethan. "Some people just don't understand the standards expected in first class." The comment, dripping with insinuation, hung in the air between them. Laura saw Ethan's shoulders tense, though he gave no other indication he'd heard. But she knew he had. After 19 years of watching passengers, she recognized the careful stillness of someone absorbing a blow they'd experienced too many times before. "Our standards apply to everyone equally, ma'am," Laura replied, her voice cooler than the professional temperature she usually maintained, "including expectations of courtesy." Patricia's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting I'm being discourteous? I'm simply concerned about maintaining the quality of experience I've paid for." Before Laura could respond, the aircraft encountered a patch of turbulence, the sudden drop causing her to grip the seat back for balance. The seatbelt sign chimed on Captain Thompson's voice following. "Folks, we've hit some unexpected rough air. Flight attendants, please take your seats. We'll be through this in about 10 minutes. Laura made her way back to the jump seat, frustration burning in her chest. The injustice of Patricia's behavior, coupled with the accumulated stress of her personal situation, formed a volatile mixture she struggled to contain. As the aircraft bucked and swayed through the turbulence, Laura closed her eyes and practiced the breathing techniques her therapist had recommended, techniques she'd abandoned, along with the therapy sessions she could no longer afford after David left. When the turbulence subsided and the seatbelt sign turned off, Laura returned to the first-class cabin to find Patricia Langston's mimosa had spilled across her tray table, droplets staining her expensive suit. "This is unacceptable," Patricia fumed as Laura approached with towels. "My suit is ruined. I have meetings in Miami, important meetings. Who's going to take responsibility for this?" "I apologize for the turbulence, ma'am," Laura said mechanically, helping to blot the stain. "Unfortunately, air currents are beyond our control." "Well, someone should have secured my drink," Patricia insisted. "I'll be filing a complaint and expecting compensation for the cleaning." Laura bit back the retort that passengers were instructed to secure items during turbulence, and instead said, "I'll be happy to note that in the flight report. Can I bring you another drink? A gin and tonic double gin." Patricia handed over the soiled napkins with distaste. "And perhaps you should check on that boy. He looks like he might be feeling ill. I don't want any unpleasantness in the cabin." Laura glanced at Ethan, who appeared perfectly fine, reading his book with the same quiet concentration as before. "He seems fine to me, but I'll check in with him." After delivering Patricia's double gin and tonic, which received another dissatisfied frown, Laura paused at Ethan's seat. "Everything okay here? Can I get you anything?" Ethan looked up, momentarily startled at being addressed. "No, thank you, ma'am. I'm good." His politeness, so at odds with Patricia's demanding behavior, softened something in Laura. "That's an impressive book you're reading. Thinking about becoming a pilot like your dad." A genuine smile transformed the boy's serious face. "Maybe. I'm more interested in designing the planes than flying them, though. I want to build something that changes how people travel." "That's quite a goal," Laura said, finding herself unexpectedly charmed by his earnestness. "My dad says aim high, or stay on the ground." Ethan shrugged, then added quietly, "He had to aim pretty high to get where he is." The implication was clear, and Laura felt a twinge of shame for her earlier assumptions. "Well, he's one of our best captains. The crew always appreciates flying with him." For the first time since boarding, Ethan's guarded expression fully relaxed. "Thanks for saying that. He works really hard." The genuine moment was interrupted by Patricia's voice from across the aisle. "Excuse me, I need another napkin. This one is too small." As Laura turned away, she heard Patricia mutter to the businessman beside her. "Honestly, the standards have really slipped. First they let anyone buy a first-class ticket, now the service is suffering too." Laura's hands shook slightly as she retrieved more napkins from the galley. Maria noticed immediately. "That bad, huh?" "She's making comments about Ethan. Not quite explicit enough to call out, but he can hear every word." Laura's voice was tight with suppressed anger. "And I can't stop thinking about how it must feel to be 16 and have some stranger deciding you don't belong somewhere based on nothing but how you look." Maria placed a steadying hand on Laura's arm. "Want me to switch sections with you? I've got thicker skin for these types." Laura shook her head. "No, I need to handle this." But as the flight progressed past the halfway mark, Laura's ability to handle anything felt increasingly tenuous. Her phone, checked during a brief galley break, showed 3 missed calls from her landlord and a text from David. "Can't make the payment this week. Tight on cash. We'll double up next month." The casual disregard, the broken promise that would lead to yet another financial crisis. It sent a surge of helpless rage through Laura that left her lightheaded. The unfairness of it all, her ex-husband's ability to simply opt out of responsibility while she scrambled to keep her life from collapsing, combined with Patricia Langston's ongoing commentary about standards and belonging and who deserved what. When Laura returned to the cabin, Patricia was speaking to the businessman beside her in a voice deliberately pitched to Carrie. "I just think there should be some standards. You know, I remember when flying first class meant something when it was exclusive. Now they hand out upgrades to anyone, and we all have to pretend it's the same experience." Ethan had put in earbuds, his music presumably drowning out Patricia's comments, but the tightness around his eyes suggested he'd heard plenty before choosing to block it out. As Laura passed his seat, she noticed he was no longer reading, but staring out the window, his reflection in the plexiglass revealing an expression too resigned for someone so young. "More ice," Patricia demanded without preamble when Laura approached. "This is mostly melted." Laura took the glass wordlessly, returning to the galley, where she gripped the counter edge until her knuckles whitened. Maria observed her with growing concern. "Laura, seriously, let me take over out there. You look like you're about to snap." "I'm fine," Laura insisted, though they both knew it was a lie. She couldn't articulate even to herself why Patricia's behavior had become the focal point for all her accumulated frustration and hurt. Perhaps because it represented everything she'd been struggling against, the casual cruelty of the privileged, the assumptions made about who belonged where, the way some people could simply take what they wanted while others had to fight for basic dignity. Returning to the cabin with Patricia's refreshed drink, Laura found Ethan standing in the aisle, his tall frame slightly hunched as though trying to make himself smaller. He was reaching carefully across Patricia's seat toward the window. "What do you think you're doing?" Patricia demanded loudly, her voice sharp with accusation. My earbud fell, Ethan explained, gesturing to the small white object that had apparently rolled across the floor and under Patricia's seat by the window. I'm sorry, I was trying not to disturb you. Well, you are disturbing me, Patricia retorted. You can't just reach across my personal space without permission. Several passengers had turned to watch the interaction drawn by Patricia's raised voice. Ethan took a step back, his expression carefully neutral in a way that spoke of practiced self-control. I apologize, ma'am. May I please retrieve my earbud from under your seat? I suppose, Patricia replied with exaggerated magnanimity. Though you should be more careful with expensive items if you can't afford to replace them. The gratuitous cruelty of the comment, the assumption laden within it, sent a flush of anger across Laura's neck. As Ethan crouched to retrieve his earbud, careful not to touch any part of Patricia's seat, Laura noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Here's your fresh drink, ma'am, Laura said, placing it deliberately between Patricia and her unfolding prejudice. Finally, Patricia muttered, then added more loudly as Ethan straightened with his recovered earbud. And you might want to check this young man's ticket again. I'm not convinced he's supposed to be in this cabin. Something in Laura, perhaps her last thread of professional restraint, snapped. His ticket is perfectly valid, Ms. Langston. He's exactly where he belongs. Well, I disagree, Patricia replied, with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. I've been flying first class for decades, and I know when someone doesn't fit the profile. Ethan stood frozen earbud clutched in his hand, his expression a careful mask that couldn't quite hide the hurt beneath. In that moment, Laura saw not just Captain Thompson's son, but every person who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong, including herself, fighting to maintain her apartment, her dignity, her place in a world that seemed determined to push her out. The only person in this cabin displaying behavior inappropriate for first class is you, ma'am, Laura said, her voice low but intense. Your comments have been noted, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep any further thoughts about other passengers to yourself. Patricia's face flushed with indignation. How dare you speak to me that way? I want your name and employee number. I'll be reporting this insubordination to your supervisor. Laura Bennett, and you're welcome to report whatever you like. Laura turned to Ethan, whose eyes had widened at her intervention. Is there anything else you need? No, ma'am, he replied quietly. Thank you. As Ethan returned to his seat, Patricia's voice rose again. This is outrageous. I've never been treated this way. That boy was practically assaulting me, reaching across my seat, and now the flight attendant is taking his side. The businessman beside her made a non-committal sound, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into the conflict. Other passengers exchanged glances, some embarrassed, others quietly observing the drama unfolding in the premium cabin. Laura felt a hand on her elbow, Maria, who had approached from the galley, her expression concerned. Everything okay up here? We could hear raised voices. Ms. Langston is unhappy with the service, Laura replied, the professional words at odds with the tremor in her voice. Perhaps you could assist her for the remainder of the flight. Maria's eyes moved between Laura's flushed face and Patricia's indignant expression. Of course, Ms. Langston, is there something specific I can help you with? As Maria smoothly took over, Laura retreated to the galley, her heart pounding uncomfortably against her ribs. The confrontation had left her shaky, adrenaline mixing with the exhaustion and stress she'd been carrying for months. She pressed her palms against the cool metal counter, trying to regulate her breathing. The interphone buzzed, the cockpit calling. Laura picked up with dread coiling in her stomach. "This is the captain," came William Thompson's deep voice. "Everything okay back there? We heard there might be a situation." "Just a minor passenger issue, Captain," Laura replied, striving for a normal tone. "It's being handled." There was a pause then. "Is my son involved?" The jump seat attendant mentioned hearing his name. Laura hesitated, unsure how much to share. There was a small misunderstanding, but it's resolved now. Your son is fine. Another pause. I'll take your word for it, Bennett. We're starting our descent in about 15 minutes. Keep me posted if anything changes. Yes, Captain. As Laura hung up the interphone, Maria slipped into the galley. What did you say to that woman she's demanding the captain be informed of disruptive elements in the cabin? I defended Ethan. She kept making these comments, Maria, implying he didn't belong in first class, asking me to check his ticket. You should have seen his face, like he was used to it, like it was just another Wednesday for him to be treated that way. Maria's expression softened. Your heart was in the right place, but you know we're supposed to de-escalate, not confront. So we just let passengers treat others that way. We smile and serve drinks while someone makes a child feel like they don't deserve the space they're in. The words emerged more forcefully than Laura intended, carrying the weight of her own recent struggles. You know that's not what I mean, Maria replied gently. But now Patricia's threatening to call corporate the moment we land, and you're already on thin ice with that passenger complaint from last month. The reminder of her precarious professional standing sent a chill through Laura. She couldn't afford to lose this job, literally could not afford it. Yet the thought of returning to the cabin, of serving Patricia Langston with a smile while Ethan sat watchfully nearby, made her stomach clench. I'll apologize to her, Laura conceded, the words bitter on her tongue. Smooth things over. Maria squeezed her arm. I've got her for now. You take care of the rest of the cabin. And Laura, you're a good person, don't forget that. But as Laura returned to the first-class cabin, Patricia Langston was already escalating the situation. Standing near her seat, she was addressing the surrounding passengers as though making a public service announcement. I just want everyone to be aware that the service on this flight has been completely unacceptable. I've been a loyal customer for years, and I've never been spoken to with such disrespect, and all because I expressed legitimate concerns about security and proper ticketing. Ethan had shrunk into his seat, earbuds firmly in place, his gaze fixed determinedly out to the window. But the rigid set of his shoulders revealed he was hearing every word. Ms. Langston, Laura began, approaching with forced calm. I apologize if you felt my tone was inappropriate. Perhaps we could discuss your concerns privately. Patricia turned to her with triumphant indignation. Now you want to be professional after humiliating me in front of the entire cabin? I don't think so. I'll be speaking directly to your superiors about this incident. That's your right, Laura acknowledged, fighting to maintain her composure. The seatbelt sign chimed on, accompanied by Captain Thompson's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into the Miami area. At this time, we ask that you return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and bring your seat backs and tray tables to their upright positions. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival. Patricia remained standing, a point of defiance in the otherwise compliant cabin. I'll sit when I'm ready. I'm still waiting for an adequate response to my complaints. Laura felt Maria beside her, a steadying presence. Ms. Langston, Maria said smoothly, I understand you're upset, and we take your concerns seriously. I've already made a note for our customer relations team to contact you. For now, however, FAA regulations require all passengers to be seated with seatbelts fastened during descent. Patricia hesitated, caught between her desire to continue the confrontation and the authoritative tone Maria had perfected over decades of handling difficult passengers. Finally, with a dramatic sigh, she returned to her seat. This isn't over, she warned as she fastened her seatbelt. Not by a long shot. As Laura and Maria moved through the cabin, checking that seats and tray tables were properly positioned for landing, Laura felt the weight of Patricia's stare boring into her back. The woman was right about one thing: this wasn't over. There would be a complaint, possibly a formal reprimand, another mark against Laura in a personnel file already noted with emotional regulation concerns following her divorce. When Laura passed Ethan's seat, she noticed he had removed his earbuds and was sitting with perfect first-class posture, his seatbelt securely fastened, his tray table stowed. He glanced up at her with a small, grateful smile that made her chest ache with the unfairness of it all, that this poised, polite young man had to experience such treatment, and that his father commanding the aircraft from the cockpit didn't even know. The descent into Miami was smooth, the aircraft breaking through a layer of evening clouds to reveal the glittering city skyline below. Under different circumstances, Laura might have appreciated the beauty of the approach, the iconic Miami skyline emerging from the twilight. Instead, she moved mechanically through her landing preparations, her mind cycling through the potential consequences of the confrontation with Patricia. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Laura noticed Ethan gathering his belongings with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to leaving nothing behind. Patricia Langston sat with regal stiffness, ostentatiously ignoring both Laura and the boy, whose presence had so offended her sensibilities. In the cockpit, William Thompson guided the aircraft toward the assigned gate with the same precision he brought to every aspect of his professional life. The evening clouds had parted, providing a clear view of Miami International Airport as they made their final approach. Beside him, First Officer Lee completed the landing checklist, their coordination seamless after a routine flight. But William's thoughts were not entirely on the technical aspects of landing. The call from the cabin earlier, the mention of a situation involving Ethan, had left a residue of concern he couldn't entirely dismiss. The flight attendant, Bennett, had assured him it was resolved, but something in her voice had suggested more complexity than her words acknowledged. William had spent his career developing the ability to compartmentalize, to focus entirely on the task at hand, regardless of personal distractions. It was a skill essential for pilots who could not afford to let outside concerns affect their operation of aircraft carrying hundreds of lives. Now he applied that discipline, setting aside his questions about Ethan until the plane was safely on the ground and his professional responsibilities completed. As the aircraft came to a stop at the gate and the engines spooled down, William completed the shutdown procedures, then turned to Lee. "Good flight," he said, the standard acknowledgement between pilots after an uneventful journey. Lee nodded, already gathering his flight materials. "Weather cooperated all the way. You staying in Miami tonight?" "Yes, my son and I have a University of Miami tour tomorrow, taking the late flight back to New York tomorrow evening. First college visit." "First serious one?" Lee asked, his tone conversational as they prepared to exit the cockpit. "First serious one," William confirmed. "He's been interested in their aerospace engineering program since middle school." "Smart kid," Lee commented. "Follows the old man's interest but wants to build the planes instead of fly them, huh?" William smiled paternal pride, momentarily displacing his lingering concern. "Something like that, though. I think he'd make a damn good pilot if he wanted." Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the cockpit door, the lead flight attendant signaling that deplaning was about to begin. William pressed the overhead button for the PA system, delivering his customary arrival announcement with practiced warmth. As passengers began to gather their belongings, William remained in the cockpit, completing final paperwork, while Lee exited to retrieve his personal items from the crew area. William planned to wait until most passengers had deplaned before emerging to meet Ethan, a habit developed over years of flying, allowing him to avoid the crush of passengers eager to exit. The interphone buzzed again. William answered, expecting the standard notification that all passengers had deplaned. Instead, the jump seat attendant's voice came through, tense with urgency. "Captain Thompson, there's a situation in first class with your son and flight attendant Bennett." William's heart rate accelerated, the professional calm he maintained during in-flight emergencies suddenly harder to access when his son was involved. "What kind of situation? You should come quickly, sir." William was moving before the attendant finished speaking, emerging from the cockpit into the forward galley. He could hear raised voices from the first-class cabin, a woman's indignant tone, the murmur of concerned passengers, and then, most alarmingly, silence. As he stepped into the cabin, the scene before him froze in a tableau of tension. Laura Bennett, standing with her hand suspended in the air, Ethan with a reddening mark on his cheek. Passengers watching in stunned silence. The look on his son's face hurt confusion. A dignity maintained at obvious cost sent a surge of protective rage through William that he hadn't felt since Ethan came home from 3rd grade with a bloody nose and a story about kids who said he didn't belong at their lunch table. Without conscious thought, William reached for the nearest handset, activating the PA system. His voice, when it emerged, carried the full authority of his command position, though his eyes never left the tableau before him. "This is Captain Thompson speaking. Flight attendant Laura Bennett, please report to the cockpit immediately." He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "That's my son you just struck." The silence that followed was absolute. The aircraft came to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers began the familiar ritual of standing to retrieve items from overhead bins, despite the door remaining closed. Captain Thompson's voice came over the PA system one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Miami International Airport, where the local time is 11:47 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 78 degrees. On behalf of Atlantic Airways and our Miami-based crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We know you have choices when you travel, and we appreciate you choosing Atlantic. Please remain seated until we've parked at the gate and turned off the seatbelt sign, which I've just done. Have a wonderful evening in the beautiful Miami area." As the door opened and first-class passengers began to deplane, Laura stood at the exit row, offering the practiced farewell she had delivered thousands of times. "Thank you for flying with us today. Have a nice evening." Patricia Langston approached the exit with her designer carry-on, pausing deliberately in front of Laura. "I'll be speaking to your supervisor about your behavior today and about the company you choose to keep." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward Ethan, who was waiting patiently several passengers behind her. Something in Laura, the last thread of professional restraint, perhaps stretched dangerously thin. "Have a nice evening, Ms. Langston." She managed her smile, fixed and brittle. As Patricia moved past her into the jet bridge, Laura heard her mutter, "Completely unprofessional taking that boy's side when he clearly didn't belong there." The comment, delivered just loudly enough to be heard, was the final straw. 19 years of holding her tongue, of smiling through passenger entitlement, and rudeness of maintaining composure, while her personal life unraveled, all of it crystallized into a single moment of fury that overwhelmed her better judgment. Laura stepped away from the door, approaching Ethan, where he stood waiting in the deplaning line. "I need to see your boarding pass," she said loudly, her voice carrying through the quiet cabin. Ethan looked up, startled. "My boarding pass, but we've already—" "Now!" Laura insisted, her hand extended, aware of the remaining passengers watching the interaction with confusion. Bewildered, Ethan pulled his boarding pass from his pocket and handed it to her. Laura made a show of examining it, then looked up with exaggerated surprise. "Well, what do you know? It seems Ms. Langston was right after all. You don't belong in first class." Patricia stood watching from the jet bridge entrance, a vindicated smile spreading across her face. Ethan's expression crumpled in confusion and hurt. "I don't understand." "You don't belong in first class," Laura continued, her voice rising with the reckless momentum of someone who had held back too much for too long. "You belong in the cockpit with your father, Captain Thompson, the man who flies this entire plane, who is responsible for everyone's safety, including Ms. Langston's. The man who has earned every stripe on his shoulder through hard work and excellence. Patricia's smile faltered as several passengers exchanged glances, the implication of Laura's words becoming clear. Ethan stood frozen. His boarding pass still extended, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "Laura," Maria warned quietly from behind her. "That's enough." But it wasn't enough, not after months of swallowing her own pain, not after watching this boy endure casual cruelty with practiced resignation. Laura took a step closer to Ethan, her voice lowering to address him directly. "You have every right to be in through the cabin, more right than most of us, and don't let anyone ever make you feel otherwise." The sharp crack of skin against skin silences the first-class cabin instantly. Laura Bennett's hand hangs suspended in the air, her own shocked expression mirroring that of the teenage boy, whose cheek now bears the crimson imprint of her fingers. 27 passengers collectively hold their breath. The boy's eyes, wide with disbelief, fill with tears he refuses to let fall. "I didn't," he starts, but Laura cuts him off with a trembling finger pointed directly at his face. "I don't care who you think you are," she hisses, voice low, but carrying in the deathly quiet cabin. "You don't belong up here." That's when the overhead speakers crackle to life, and a deep, authoritative voice fills the cabin. "This is Captain Thompson speaking. Flight attendant Laura Bennett, please report to the cockpit immediately." And the voice pauses, then adds with deliberate emphasis, "That's my son you just struck." The horrified silence that follows is deafening. Laura stands paralyzed, her hand still suspended in the air, as the reality of what she's done crashes over her like turbulence. 19 years of service gone in a single, impulsive moment. Ethan remains utterly still, one hand rising slowly to his reddened cheek, his eyes reflecting not anger, but a profound sadness that cuts Laura more deeply than rage ever could. Maria is beside her instantly, her voice low and urgent. "What have you done? Go to the cockpit now." Patricia Langston's triumphant expression has transformed to shock, her earlier complaints forgotten in the face of this far more dramatic development. The remaining passengers stare in uncomfortable silence, unwilling to move toward the exit, while the scene continues to unfold before them. "Ethan," Laura begins, her voice cracking on his name. "I didn't mean—" "Go," Maria repeats more firmly this time. "I'll stay with him." The walk to the cockpit feels endless, each step carrying Laura closer to the end of her career, to the consequences of a moment's loss of control. She knocks tentatively on the cockpit door, the sound impossibly loud in the hushed cabin. The door opens to reveal First Officer Daniel Lee, his expression carefully neutral as he steps aside to let her enter. Inside, Captain William Thompson sits in the left seat, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his uniform, his back to her as he completes the shutdown checklist with mechanical precision. "Captain," Laura begins, her voice barely audible. "I can explain. Can you—" He turns slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury that reminds her suddenly painfully of his son's practiced composure. "Can you explain why my 16-year-old son, who has never been anything but respectful to every person he's ever met, has your handprint on his face?" Laura opens her mouth, but no words emerge. How can she explain the perfect storm that led to this moment? Her financial stress, her ex-husband's betrayal, Patricia Langston's prejudice, her own growing rage at the injustices, large and small, that had accumulated in her life. None of it excuses what she's done. "I'm sorry," she finally manages. "I was trying to defend him from a passenger who was making comments suggesting he didn't belong in first class, and then somehow I lost control." Captain Thompson's expression doesn't soften. "You lost control on my son." "There's no excuse," Laura acknowledges, her voice steadying as she accepts the reality of her situation. "I'll submit my resignation immediately." "That's not your decision to make," Captain Thompson replies, his tone precise. "There are procedures for incidents like this, procedures I intend to follow to the letter." First Officer Lee clears his appassionati throat awkwardly. "Captain, I can finish the post-flight if you want to check on Ethan." Captain Thompson nods once, sharply. "Thank you, Daniel." He turns back to Laura. "Wait here. We're not finished." As Captain Thompson exits the cockpit, leaving her alone with the silent first officer, Laura sinks into the jump seat, the enormity of her actions settling over her like a physical weight. She has struck a passenger, a minor, the captain's son. There is no coming back from this, no explanation that will preserve her career or her livelihood. In the main cabin, she can hear the murmur of voices, the sound of passengers finally deplaning the quiet professional tones of Maria managing the situation she has created. And beneath it all, the knowledge that her life as she knows it has just ended. Minutes pass, or perhaps hours' time, has become strangely elastic in the aftermath of disaster. When Captain Thompson returns to the cockpit, his expression has shifted from fury to something more complex, more considered. "My son refuses to press charges," he says without preamble. Laura looks up, startled. "What? Ethan refuses to press charges? He says you were defending him from a passenger who was making racist comments, and that you didn't mean to hit him, that it was a reflexive action when he stood up suddenly." The grace of the boy's lie, his protection of her despite what she's done, brings tears to Laura's eyes. "That's not what happened. I lost my temper. I hit him." Captain Thompson studies her for a long moment. "Yes, you did. And there's no excuse for that, no matter what provocation you might have experienced." "I know," Laura whispers. "But," he continues, "I've known you for 8 years now, flown with you dozens of times, never seen anything but professionalism from you. So I have to ask myself, what could have pushed someone with your record to this point?" Laura remains silent, unwilling to offer excuses when there are none. "Ethan told me about the passenger Patricia Langston, about the comments she made throughout the flight, about how you intervened when no one else would." Captain Thompson's voice remains steady, but something in his eyes shifts. "He also said you were the only crew member who treated him like he belonged in that cabin from the beginning." "He did belong there," Laura says softly. "Yes, he did." Captain Thompson sighs, the sound heavy with a weariness. Laura recognizes the exhaustion of fighting battles most people never have to face. "I'm not excusing what you did. It was unacceptable, and there will be consequences. But I'm also not going to let a 20-year career end over a single mistake, however serious, without understanding the context." Hope, dangerous, fragile, flickers to life in Laura's chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm going to file an incident report that reflects what actually happened, including Ms. Langston's behavior throughout the flight and the stress you were under. I'm saying that while you'll likely face suspension and mandatory counseling, I'm not going to recommend termination." The unexpected reprieve leaves Laura speechless. "Why?" she finally manages. "After what I did to your son?" "Because Ethan asked me not to," Captain Thompson replies simply. "Because he believes you were trying to help even if you went about it completely wrong. And because I've spent my entire career dealing with people who make assumptions about who belongs where, and I understand what it means to finally reach your breaking point. The parallel between them, the shared experience of fighting to maintain dignity in spaces where others question your right to exist, settles between them unspoken but acknowledged." "I don't deserve this chance," Laura says honestly. "Probably not." Captain Thompson agrees with unexpected candor. "But you're getting it anyway. What matters now is what you do with it." In the silence that follows, Laura feels something shift within her. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but the possibility of redemption, a chance to rebuild, not just her career, but herself, to find a way forward that honors the grace she's been unexpectedly offered. "Thank you," she says finally. "I won't waste this opportunity." Captain Thompson nods once, then gestures toward the door. "Ethan is waiting in the jet bridge. I think you owe him an apology before we leave." Laura follows him out of the cockpit, each step heavy with the weight of accountability. The aircraft is empty now, the passengers gone. Only Maria remaining as she completes final cabin checks. She gives Laura a questioning look, which Laura answers with a small nod, not okay, but surviving. In the jet bridge, Ethan waits alone, his tall frame leaning against the wall, his cheek still bearing the faint imprint of her hand. When he sees her, he straightens his expression, guarded but not hostile. "Ethan." Laura begins, her voice thick with regret. "I am so sorry for what I did. There is no excuse, no justification that could ever make it right. What I did was wrong, and I will carry that knowledge with me every day." The boy studies her for a long moment, his eyes so like his father's, serious and assessing. "You were trying to help," he says finally. "Before that, you were the only one who said anything when she kept making those comments." "That doesn't excuse my actions afterward," Laura insists. "I was supposed to protect you, not hurt you." Ethan touches his cheek lightly. "It didn't really hurt, not physically anyway." The implication that the emotional hurt was worse sends a fresh wave of shame through Laura. "I'm sorry," she repeats, inadequate but sincere. "I know," Ethan says simply. Then with wisdom beyond his years, he adds, "We all have breaking points, even the people who seem like they have it all together." Laura thinks of her carefully maintained facade, the professional competence that had masked her growing desperation and despair. "Yes, we do," Captain Thompson places a hand on his son's shoulder. "We should go. We've got a college tour tomorrow morning." Ethan nods, then turns back to Laura. "I hope things get better for you, whatever you're going through." The genuine concern that this boy she has wronged would worry about her well-being brings fresh tears to Laura's eyes. "Thank you. And Ethan, you do belong everywhere. Never doubt that." A small smile touches the corner of his mouth. "I know. My dad made sure I knew that from day one." As they turn to leave, Captain Thompson pauses. "Bennett, get some help. Whatever's going on in your life that brought you to this point, don't try to handle it alone." "I will," Laura promises, and for the first time in months, she means it. She watches them walk away, father and son, moving through the world with a dignity and grace she can only hope to emulate. In their wake, she feels both the weight of her actions and unexpectedly the lightness of possibility. One mistake, however terrible, does not have to define her. One moment of lost control does not erase who she has been or who she might still become. Maria appears beside her, silent but supportive. "You okay?" "No," Laura answers honestly, "but I will be." The weeks following the incident unfolded in a blur of procedures and consequences. Laura received a 30-day suspension without pay, a financial blow that would have devastated her completely if not for Maria's insistence on being her roommate, just until things stabilize. The mandatory counseling sessions, which she had once dismissed as an unaffordable luxury, became a lifeline, the therapist helping her untangle the complex knot of factors that had led to her breaking point. Atlantic Airways' HR department connected her with resources she hadn't known existed. An employee assistance program that provided financial counseling, a legal aid service that helped her file for enforcement of her alimony agreement, a support group for airline employees dealing with stress and burnout. The infrastructure had been there all along. Laura had simply been too proud, too determined to handle everything alone to access it. David, confronted by an actual legal notice, rather than Laura's increasingly desperate pleas, began making regular payments again. Her landlord, presented with documentation of the forthcoming funds, agreed to a payment plan for the overdue rent. The ground beneath her feet, which had felt so unstable for so long, began to solidify. The most unexpected development came 3 weeks into her suspension, when she received an email from Karen Thompson, Captain Thompson's wife and Ethan's mother. The message was brief but direct, an invitation to coffee the next time Laura was in New York. "William told me what happened," Karen wrote. "I'd like to hear your side of the story." The meeting took place at a small cafe near New York Presbyterian Hospital, where Karen worked as a pediatrician. Laura arrived early, anxiety churning in her stomach, half expecting recrimination despite the civil tone of the invitation. Instead, she found understanding from a woman who had spent decades watching her husband and son navigate spaces where their belonging was questioned. "What you did was wrong," Karen acknowledged, stirring her tea with measured movements. "But why you did it, that part, I understand better than most." They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing from the incident on the plane to broader discussions of breaking points, of carrying too much alone, of the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting battles others don't even see. By the time they parted, something like friendship had begun to form, tentative but genuine. 6 months later, as Laura prepared for a flight to Paris, her first international route since returning to work, she received a text message with a photo attached. It showed Ethan in a University of Miami sweatshirt, grinning broadly in front of an engineering building. The caption read simply, "Acceptance letter came today. Dad says to tell you he's flying the family out for a campus visit next month. If you're on the crew list, he says you'd be welcome." Laura stared at the message, marveling at the capacity for forgiveness, for growth, for connection that could emerge from even the darkest moments. She had made a terrible mistake, one she would never fully forgive herself for. But from that mistake had come transformation. She was not the same person who had boarded Flight 3921 nearly a year ago, brittle with stress and isolation. The woman who now prepared to welcome passengers to the Paris flight was more grounded, more self-aware, more willing to reach for help before reaching a breaking point. As the first passengers began to board, Laura smiled a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Welcome aboard," she said, meaning it in a way she hadn't for years. "We're glad you're here. If you've made it this far in our story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to comment below and share where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story that makes you think, feel, and reflect on the complex relationships that shape our world.